Hey everybody, and welcome to Chapter 6 in the Magica Grimoire Studies course. Tonight we're going to be talking about binding spells, and before we dive into the material, I am really grateful for those who are able to be here live so that this can continue as planned as an interactive class. And I just wanted to update everybody on a few things. So if this applies to those that are watching the class on February 27th or 28th or March 1st, if you're watching it on the replay and it's outside of March or outside of the beginning of March, this probably doesn't matter as much to you because you could just watch the platform and stay up to date. But next week, which is, I have no idea what the date is, on Sunday night at 8:30, we are going to have what we're going to call Inner Alchemy Live. Right here on the platform, right here on Zoom. Events will be posted like we normally do. And the purpose of the Inner Alchemy Live broadcast will be so that some of you who might not otherwise have the opportunity to do so can jump on live on a Sunday night and ask questions about this course, about Svegonaria 101, or about the advanced course. And so we'll be having live group discussions for everything that I teach once a month, which is the way that all of the other courses on the platform go. But the actual Magica course, what you're watching right now, will continue every other week like it's been. But it's going to move from Monday night also to Sunday nights at the same time at 8:30 p.m. Eastern time. And they'll remain open for those of you that want to be here live for the class, for the discussion. And at the end of each class, I'll open it to any questions that you might have about the material, any comments you want to share. But the majority of that deeper questions and everything will take place on the Inner Alchemy Live nights, so that we get a chance to interact with more of the folks on the platform. Hopefully that'll allow us to bring more people into the discussions. But just keep in mind, if you're watching this on the replay and you're not with us live, then you can always ask questions in the comment section, and I'll answer those as well. So let's go ahead and dive in. Tonight, as I said, we're going to be talking about binding spells. And last week, we talked about the difference between binding spells and banishing spells. They're two terms that often get conflated in pop culture, esotericism, and witchcraft. Binding spells energetically restrain someone or a group of people and are among the oldest recorded spells from antiquity. And tonight I want to kind of open or broaden the perspective that some of you might have on what binding is actually about. So not long ago, a group of Serbian archaeologists uncovered a cache of 2,000-year-old skeletons, and they unearthed a set of mysterious scrolls that had Aramaic curses on them from antiquity. And there's a picture of one of the actual scrolls on the screen in front of you. And Reuters News Service reports that the scrolls contained what are thought to be ancient amulets, which looked like, when I remember when they found this, they looked like little tiny plumbing pipes, but they were only about maybe an inch in length, in which some of these scrolls were placed, and then they were sealed off, and you'd wear them around your neck or on your belt or carry them with you as an amulet. And inside, the spells are binding magic rituals. So we know that the concept of binding magic has been around for a long time. It's literally talked about in the ancient scriptures within the Abrahamic tradition. It's also something that we see in other spiritual traditions mentioned as well. In fact, it's even in, as I'm thinking about it now, we can actually find evidence of these spells being used of all places, in the New Testament in the Abrahamic tradition, because there they talk about whomsoever you shall bind on earth shall be bound in the heavens. So for a group of people that have an issue with witches, it seems to me like their scriptures talk an awful lot about spell work. So as we get started, and if either one of you want to share, you can unmute yourself and share. I want to start like we do every week and ask if either of you cares to share what stood out for you as you read this chapter on binding spells.
I liked it gave more clarity when you're binding someone to you. You basically bind them to you. So be very careful who and why you're binding them to you, because a lot of people just want to jump, oh, that's it, I'm binding them. But they don't realize that you're binding them to yourself, which, like you said in the book, also opens us up to them and for them to retaliate back to us. So that was a really, really good point. And not that many people, they just don't even bother to read that part. They want to just jump over and do.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep. And that's where you get in trouble.
I'm gonna dive into that in a little bit. Ellen, anything you wanted to share that jumped out for you?
That the same thing jumped out for me. I wish I had read that before I'd done some bindings, because that vulnerability has come back and it's not pretty. It's
Okay.
not nice at all.
If I forget, remind me, and I will address that tonight, because there's also a way to resolve that if you didn't know when you did a bind. So as the name suggests, when doing binding spells, you're creating, as you both just said, you're creating a metaphysical bond with the subject. So people traditionally think that, oh, when I'm doing a binding spell, perhaps you're binding someone to prevent them from doing something that harms themselves or harms someone you love or harms you. And indeed, the spell can work in that way. But the way that it's working in that way is your energy binding them literally to a situation, but also, or to an outcome, but also to you, because it's your energy. It becomes almost an energetic exchange. We've talked about in some of the other classes that when you're doing spell work, there's always a price that's paid. And in a binding spell, the price for that spell is an energetic connection to you. And that may not always be the best solution. And particularly when you look at some of the pop culture binding spells that appear out there. I read some of these spells by some prominent spellcasters, witches, and authors, and I'm just stunned that they would even consider doing something like that. So the big question right off the bat that we want to talk about is, do you really want to maintain that connection? And if so, why? And if you feel like you want to maintain that connection, and somebody might say, well, why would I even think about doing a binding spell in that case? Well, let's say there's somebody who is attacking you, and you need to get to the root of what it is that they're doing. One of the simplest binding spells we talk about in the book is putting them under a rock. So there's an energetic connection there. And there are a number of people that are frankly under rocks in my life. But the reason that I choose to do that is these aren't necessarily people that I hate. These aren't necessarily people I want to bring some kind of wrathful justice to. These are people that should know better, that don't know better, and that are when I'm mindful, I try to be mindful of the fact that there aren't necessarily bad people. There are people who make bad decisions or people who engage in bad actions. And certainly the ones who do that consistently are the ones that we label in our minds as bad people, because they're just people who have no impulse control. They make bad decisions. They're hot messes. And so some of those people, if it's the Mango Menace, I might do and have done spell work that's much more wrathful and induces justice in a very specific way. But if it's somebody like a cousin or an ex or a friend, or somebody that you thought was a friend, then you don't want to do anything wrathful for them, because if you really did care about them, you should still care about them right now. Their betrayal hurts, but that doesn't change your heart. That changes theirs. And so there are times when I'll give you a good example. There was somebody who I often teased about this, because I never believed that this was true. But I would tease and say that somebody put a spell on me at some time, a curse on me, that with regard to certain intimate connections I have with people. And just this past week, I found out that was true. And I found out that the person, so my intuition was obviously telling me this all along, and I was thinking it was just pretty funny. I wasn't listening to it as intuition. I was thinking it was my warped mind, and I was laughing about it. So I had always made this joke that every time I start going out with a guy, they switch from being into one particular dynamic in the relationship to another. I'm trying to not give too much information. It would make some people's hair curl. But so I said, oh, does somebody put a curse on me? I just turn all of the tops into bottoms. And this week I found out that was literally true. I was reading the journal of someone who passed, whose stuff was entrusted to us. And I found that the son of a bitch put a spell on me because they were mad about something I did. So now, one, they're no longer on this plane. Two, I still care about them. And that isn't going to change just because they did something stupid. Three, I don't necessarily dislike the outcome of their spell. Like, it didn't change my life for the worse, like I think they thought it was. It didn't ruin relationships. It just changed dynamics between people. And if you stay present, rooted in the present moment, you go with the flow. So what do I do in order to break this curse? And this is where, if you may have made a decision to bind somebody, now you want to unbind them. This is a way to do that, because I had bound that person from harming themselves. And in doing that, I created a connection. And this person was very, very new to the craft. Had a good sort of natural intuition for how to do things, but I enhanced their power by creating this metaphysical bond between them and me. Otherwise, the things I do to prevent people from getting in, from inflicting harm on me or my loved ones, would have stood. I was well worded, but I wasn't well worded when my concern about this person hurting themselves became so strong that I said, that's it, I'm binding them. And in this case, they didn't go under a rock because I wanted them to still be part of my life. I bound them using a completely different kind of spell. So the way that you break that, and we'll talk about that now, is the simplest way to break it is to get a small pillar candle, like the ones that are, I don't know, maybe 3 inches, and then 2, 4, or 5 inch either pillar candles or taper candles. I usually will use a taper candle for this. And the ones that in fact, I think I just used the last one I did. The ones that they use for, like, when the power goes out are generally about 4 or 5 inches. So they're perfect for this. You place the two candle holders on either end, like bookends, and put the slightly shorter candle in the middle, light it, and your intention in the spell, you could be as dramatic or non-dramatic as you want, is that as the and then you tie a cord between a black cord between the 2 pillar candles. So the 2 pillar candles now look like a clothesline. There's a candle in the middle. You light that candle in the middle and you say, as this spell does its work, and these candles burn, the moment that this bond is broken, I'm free. And then you let the candles burn, and the candles will get smaller and smaller and smaller until that string is right in the fire in the middle and burns and separates. Now, I will tell you, because somebody had an issue with this recently and said, hey, you may want to tell somebody, tell people this, don't use yarn, and don't use or polyester materials, and don't use string like twine. Use black thread for this. It's the best way to do it, and the reason is, if you use yarn, yarn melts and can create a mess, and twine or whatever, that raffia and stuff like that, catches fire, and then you've got fire on both sides, and that could be, a mess if you don't have it on a sheet pan. But if you use just regular thread, the fire just burns it, and it burns out. The little ends on the thread just become hot, but they burn out. And then you let those candles, all three candles, completely burn as you hold that intention. By the time that those three candles have completely burned, you're done, and the energetic bond is broken between you. And it's not broken because of the candles. It's not broken because of the thread. Those are the bookmarks for where your mind was at, where your intention was. So that's a good way. If you bound somebody, you want to unbind them. If they're under a rock, you could just take them out from under the rock and burn the paper. If they're in another big thing, people who use peeing and in an ice cube tray, and freezing them out. That's another way of binding someone. But eventually, what happens is, you don't want to have a freezer full of pee, because you put food in there. So, I mean, some people will put that in a Ziploc plastic bag. Others will use a specific freezer for that. That's just used for, dried herbs and magical spells and things like that. But when the time comes that you're done with that, you throw the ice cube in a fire, or you take the ice cube outside and bury it in the ground. If you want them to stay out of your life, take the pea ice cube and put it in the ground. And then you let the intelligent network of the mycelium do its work from there. Just don't be mindful where you're planting it where you're putting it in the ground, because you also don't want to do damage to trees or to food you may be growing with too much acidity with that uric acid. So dig a hole in the middle of the yard and put it in there. And then what I like to do then is pour hot water over the buried ice cube, so that it's going to dilute it and dissipate it and not be a thing anymore. More than not, I'll just toss it in the fire. Now, you could not only, as I said, bind someone from harming someone or interfering in a relationship, interfering in a job, but you can actually use binding spells to bind someone to a certain outcome. So this is another one of those areas in which it may not be a problem to have a connection. So say your child or your spouse or your best friend is trying to win a court case, or they're trying to win a sports competition or get that job. You can bind them to success. And the easiest way to do that is taking their name, writing it on a bay leaf, for example, if it's to get a job. Binding them to success by writing their name on one side of a piece of paper, the judge's name on the other side of a piece of paper, and going to court with them that day with that piece of paper in your left shoe. There's a bunch of different ways, a bunch of different spells that you could do, but you're binding the person then to a certain outcome. And when you do that, you're taking responsibility energetically. Every time you do a spell, you're taking responsibility for that spell. This is your energy, your craft. So that's where the mindfulness comes in. Now, if you're binding someone to and that's where we have to use common sense. I wouldn't bind somebody to getting a certain job, because what if they hated that job? Now I've created a metaphysical bond to them, to a situation that they don't like. So there's going to be resentment that comes out of that. There's going to be other issues that come out of that. And I didn't do any good. So instead, think of what as we talked about a couple weeks ago, think about what the real outcome, the why. The why isn't that they want a job. The why is they want to be in a job that they love. If they want to be in a job that pays them well, they want to be in a job maybe that gives them more free time with their family or their loved ones, or for their hobbies, or starting a new business. So make that what you bind them to. Bind them to a successful business venture, bind them to finding the right job at all. And I would always say to finding the right job at all times, because the right job could be right now. The right relationship might be, it might not be Mr. Right, it might be Mr. Right now. And that helps them make some progress in their emotional baggage and their healing, and their, maybe they have a relationship with somebody who's processing trauma. That's a great relationship, but they both process their trauma, they become healthier, and they realize they don't need to be together in that way anymore. So you've said, at all times, they'll be in the right relationship. And I'm absolutely convinced that in my life, it's why I have only had one, not even a bad breakup, but one relationship where we decided to part ways and never speak again. And even that was done amicably, because I say that whatever is for my greatest good now, and 10 minutes from now, it might not be for my greatest good. And so I'm opening myself energetically. So do that with your spell work, not just for you, but for others as well. Remember, we're always casting spells. And that's the other thing. If you're binding someone and that's creating a metaphysical bond to you, and you obsess over that so-and-so is under a rock, as many of you saw me do with a certain obscene character from New Orleans, I was mindful of the fact that every time they got under my nails, I was creating another bind to them. And so they were always able to get around blocking them on Facebook or blocking them on Instagram, and they were constantly interfering in my life. And I just finally said that I need to destroy any binds, that, any ties between me and that person. And it was tough, because that person had connections to my uncle. And, they at one time had Zeolio's sword. And it was making me crazy that I felt like I had to have this person in my life to keep an eye on them. I finally said, I'm done. This person no longer exists in my world. And by dissolving those binds, that person no longer exists in my world. I never heard a peep from them. They don't speak my name. They don't bother me on my YouTube channel. I'm not constantly having to delete their comments on Facebook. They just went away. And you have to, like right in this moment, because I talked about them, I'm saying in my mind right now, and I let them go again, because I don't want those energetic connections. So before I see if there are questions that anyone has, I just want to bring one other point to the table about binding. And then there's going to be some binding that you see in some of the other chapters. So I want you to kind of be a little mindful of that, a little aware, and say, aha, this incorporates some aspects of binding, or this incorporates some aspects of banishing. But remember that at all times, you're always manifesting magic in your life, because it's not something we do, it's who we are. It's our worldview. And when you do that, never be afraid of like, really, that's why it's so important to sit with the ancestors in the morning, because you're not just sitting with them, you're sitting with yourself. And when something comes up and you say, you know what, maybe that wasn't the best thing I can do, rather than feeling guilty or feeling scared or feeling disempowered or waiting for the other shoe to drop, do a new spell. Say, thank you for this awareness to the universe. Thank you for this awareness to your mind. and say, and now I choose to do blah, blah, blah. Now I choose to manifest such and such. And one of the best ways to do when any of the banishing and binding spells that are in the book, as well as probably most of the ones in the rest of the book, but I'm not 100% sure because I don't have all of the spells that are in the book committed to memory. But in most of the spell work that I do, that 3-6-9 progression, as pop culture is calling it now, comes into play. So one of the easiest ways to make sure that a spell works, if you're unsure of yourself, is write it down on a piece of paper 9 times. Read that piece of paper out loud 6 times and do it consistently for 3 days. So, and there's no way to mess it up. If you messed it up and you wrote it down 3 times, read the 3 times 6, and then did it for 9 days, what is that? I'm gonna open this up for a question and see how many folks have picked this up from another course. If you do 3, let's call it 3 intentions written on a piece of paper, very clearly, very specifically, and you read those aloud, the entire thing 6 times, and you do that, read them aloud 6 times for 9 days. What does that look like? Something else in our lives, in maybe in our culture.
Isn't that like a novena?
Exactly. There's your Catholic conjure connection. So the reason that novenas are so powerful is because now somebody else has written down the intention for you to make it even easier, and that's how you can use a grimoire. Somebody else has written down the spell as it worked for them. So as we move into the next phase, which is really going to be where we start to talk about making these spells your own, and starting out in chapter 7 with ritual cleansing and preparation, I want you to think of the grimoire itself as being like a book of novenas, or a book of it is a book of spells, like a almost a cheat sheet. Here's spells that have worked for John Michael, and in this particular book's case, they've worked for me for 50 years. That's how they got included. The ones that sometimes they work, sometimes they don't, or the ones I found too complicated or unnecessarily complex, I left out of this grimoire, because it's simpler, always makes more sense, always produces more predictable outcomes. But this is just the template. This is just the cheat sheet. So if you need to do something in a hurry, you can grab the book, you can go to the spell and know you're going to get predictable results. But even when you've done that, I encourage you to start thinking about, what can I do to increase or enhance this spell to make it my own? And so it might be that you do my spell first, and then on the second day, you do my spell with leaving yourself open to whatever you might feel like you want to add. And then on the third day, do it completely yours. Like, put the book away, do a spell. It may be most of the same elements that were in my spell, because that might be your way. But really start from chapter 7 on, thinking about, okay, just like a cookbook. You read a cookbook, you see the ingredients that are in it, maybe a particular sauce or gravy or dish that you're making has tarragon in it, and you don't like the taste of tarragon. Well, you look for something that you can substitute in it. Or maybe it's got garlic, you don't like garlic, or it's got hot peppers, you don't like hot peppers. You would adjust, you wouldn't make a big deal out of it. You would just say, well, this dish sounds good, but I don't want hot peppers in mine because I don't like spicy food, or I don't want tarragon in mine because I just don't like that taste. So maybe you substitute garlic for the tarragon, or you substitute, thyme or rosemary for the tarragon. That's what I want you to do with the grimoire. Think of it like a magical cookbook. And you go through the spells, you let them wash over you. And if something doesn't feel right, and next week or in 2 weeks, we're going to talk about how to set yourself up so that you'll always know if the spell is right for you. And that comes when we do our ritual cleansing and preparation. So before we go, this will be the kind of the format that we do for everybody who's watching the replay going forward. I'll do about a 20-minute or so. I went a little over tonight because I was explaining the other stuff about the schedule in the beginning, but about 20-25 minutes of actual course material. And then I'll open it up to those who are here live if they have any questions or any comments that they want to share. And then when we have our next inner alchemy, I'm going to pull up my schedule real quick and look. So our next inner alchemy live is going to be actually Sunday the 5th. So this coming Sunday at 8:30. So you'll have an opportunity on that night to ask me questions about the book, about this book, about the first 6 chapters. You'll have the opportunity to ask me questions about Stregoneria and its application. And the reason we're going to do this is because I don't want that it serves no purpose if you're a member of this platform and you have access to all of this information and education, but we don't encourage you to use it. So maybe you went through this Stregoneria course to just kind of reconnect with your ancestral heritage. Maybe you're doing the Catholic Conjure course to get a sense of how it's done in the Catholic esoteric tradition. Maybe you're doing the African traditional religions or the Tarot course or the Orishas course. For whatever purposes you're doing them, we want, for the courses that I'm teaching, I want to give you a place where you can start to pull all these strings together and turn them into something that's uniquely yours. Otherwise, all we're doing is like every other class that's out there that most other schools are doing. They teach you the class, and then you're so busy learning that you never really get a chance to put it into practice. So I'm trying to challenge you to constantly be putting this into practice, constantly be looking for ways that you can make this work. If, like Ellen shared, you feel like you did some binding that now you wish you didn't do, now you have a tool to go and break that. And you don't have to remember all the minutia behind it. You can just break it. Another way to do that, by the way, just because I know not everybody has candles and some people are afraid of setting their house on fire. If you knit or you crochet, you can knit or crochet just a string and then cut it, or use the fire to cut it. But again, if it's synthetic yarn, I don't recommend that. Just cut it with your regular ritual scissors, kitchen scissors. If you don't know how to knit or crochet, just make a series of knots. Just keep knotting, and then cut the knots. So recognize that the knots are all of the different ways you may have intentionally or unintentionally bound yourself to the other person, and then cut each one of those knots into bits so that you just have a pile of string. And that's why string's easier, because it's easier to do that kind of knot cutting. And we'll talk about knots in a later chapter, and knitting and all of that stuff. But I mentioned it briefly, I think in chapter 6, so I wanted to tie that in. Meanwhile, anything that either one of you want to ask or share?
I got a question.
Yeah.
So you're binding somebody to you, and let's say you just leave that bind there forever, and comes the time where both me and the other person, let's say we both die, would we still be bind in the next lifetimes, in other lifetimes?
No, because you're
What
really
does that-
not, you're not binding the two of you together. I mean, that would be a specific spell. You could do a binding, intentionally binding you and someone together with the intention of being, that in the afterlife you're bound together. I wouldn't recommend that. But you could definitely do that. But what I really mean, that's a great question, because it's energetically binding you to that person for the purposes of the spell. So what you're really doing is you're binding the person to an outcome. So that's number one. You're binding them to whatever. I'm binding you to prevent you from hurting yourself, prevent you from doing drugs, prevent you from drinking, prevent you from cheating on your wife, whatever the thing is that you're binding them to that outcome. And that's why it's important to be really specific as possible. And so don't say, I'm binding you not to cheat on your wife with another man, because they may cheat on their wife with a woman. You be specific, but by doing that, you're creating a metaphysical bond. So your spell isn't intending to create the bond, sort of the organic effect of putting that much passion and energy into something to a desired outcome creates the bond. Now that bond will break. Let's say, for example, you're doing it for somebody to win a court case. When the case is over, that bond is broken
Okay.
because it's a done
Makes
deal.
sense.
So at some point, like, and my grandmother would say, with your last breaths on this earth, release anyone that owes you anything, and ask that anyone that you owe, you be absolved from. So it's a way of, like, and she would say that, like, in front of mixed company, and we always understood that meant break those bonds, at the end of your life. Spend that time. I recommend that people do that on a monthly basis. So at the end of the, even on a weekly basis, at the end of the week, take a couple moments to dissolve anything that's no longer serving you. At the end of the month, take a couple hours. At the end of the year, take a couple days, and spend time doing that, where it's the most important work you'll ever do magic, is making sure that your slate's clean, and that your outcomes are where you want them to be. And excuse me, and then that gives you the opportunity to, if astrology is something that makes sense for you and really clicks for you, pay attention to what's happening astrologically. I promise you that when you do those kind of, and I'm not saying everybody has to do that. But maybe it's tarot cards, maybe it's consulting a different kind of oracle. Do whatever it is that helps you get clear on your why, that helps you get clear on any connections that you have to others, and helps you get clear on what is and is not for your greatest good. So there may come a time when the toxic spouse, who's an alcoholic, for example, that you just, it's for your greater good to just let go of the situation. So you might have bound them to not harm themselves and not harm you, and not go to a bar, but they continue to force their will, because their will is always going to be stronger. That's, we're sovereign humans, and just as we have the ability to do that magic, even those who don't know they're doing magic are doing magic. And so they may be fighting you. There may come a time when you say, basta, I'm done. I released all bonds to this situation and to this person. And you have to let them go and do their thing. And that's for good or for bad. It could be that you're trying to help somebody in their career, and every time that you help them get the right job, they get the right job, and then they screw it up. At some point, you just say, all right, I'm done. And that's my energy. I can't keep wasting it. They're not going to do the right thing. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
You're welcome. Ellen, anything before we go?
Yeah, thank you for the unbinding. I did have some questions about using vines or something for binding. It's for an outdoor thing, you could, if they're but the same as with the thing about the rock, use an ordinary rock and not a gemstone. Why is that? Like,
Because you're not the reason we don't use gemstones, by the way, or crystals of any kind for putting somebody under a rock, is they record energy, and they record whatever's going on. When you're doing this, at some point you want to let it go. If it's a crystal, without destroying the crystal, then you have to go through cleansing the crystal, going through a whole lunar cycle, and you're holding that energy around that you may not want, that may have become toxic. So a regular rock, it's minerals, it goes back into the earth. And what you're ultimately doing is you're dismantling the energy around the circumstance that you want to change. So whether it's positive or negative, you're dismantling what is not wanted, and you want that supported by nature itself. So we use a regular rock. Vines are perfectly good. There are a number of spells that you could do with a vine. It just I didn't include some of those in the book because of the fact that it requires really having your own property. If you're going to bind something to a vine, usually it requires you going out and wrapping the vine. If you're going to, and I'll only do those spells really with unless I'm doing baneful work. If you want something positive to come out, you want that vine to still be alive. So you could write your stuff on a piece of paper, your intention on a piece of paper, wrap a tomato vine around it, or wrap a datura vine around it. I do that a lot with datura, but I don't do it when I'm living in an apartment because somebody could walk by my patio and see the little scroll, open it up and read it, and all kinds of stuff can happen. So I don't do things like that. If you had your own property or you had the plants inside your house and they were growing, you could certainly do that. For baneful work, we'll get to that later on. That's when you would find yourself using roots that you can use for binding that are no longer alive. You could use, and you could also use roots like High John, that serve certain other purposes in your spell work that are not used for binding, that are used for for other things, for success, for drawing prosperity, for road opening, and things like that. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you have any other
So,
questions?
yeah, if you're using if you pick off a vine and use it, then that's considered baneful work.
Yeah. Yeah, because then you're using something that's going to die, and so you ask the plant if you could take that vine for whatever it is. I mean, you can use those. I'm trying not to give those spells willy-nilly, but you can imagine from having taken the course, you could use that if you want something to die on the vine
Okay.
for correspondences, and we could talk
Yeah,
more.
it gets a little trickier when you get into correspondences and things
Yeah,
like that. You really have to
and we're going to talk
be a
about
lot
that
more aware and
more
mindful of
later in
what
the
you're
course.
doing. Thank you.
All right, thank you both for being here. It's always so much easier to do these when there's someone to talk to. And for everybody who's watching us on the replay, thank you for tuning in. This will be up within the hour in the classroom, and I also posted in the platform everything I said in the beginning about what the schedule will be going forward. Hopefully that'll make it a little more accessible for everybody. And I'm looking forward to next Sunday night because it then opens us back up to continuing the conversation about the Spigoneria 101 course, about the advanced practice course, and gives me an opportunity to talk about some things off the topics of where we are that might tie in indirectly, but off the topics. And I have something this coming Sunday that I'm excited about sharing with y'all as some new scholarship that that you may not have been exposed to in greater depth. Just became available, and I'm excited to share it with everybody. And we'll do that on Sunday night. So thank you both. Have a good night. And if you have any questions and you're watching the replay, ask them in the comments. Love you guys.
Night.